This is Guideposts with Dr. Tim Stauffer, a podcast where Tim and his friends engage in purposeful conversation about identity, parenting, culture, faith, and more. Tim Stauffer is a professor of counseling and a licensed clinical counselor. My name is Sam Meyung, and I'm Tim's friend. My life has been greatly enriched by my time talking to Tim and getting his thoughts on many matters that impact my life daily. After listening to this podcast, I hope you'll feel the same. Guideposts are discernment markers. They provide opportunities for direction as well as warnings of pitfalls. Go this way and be careful of that way. We hope that each episode provides some sense of direction as we navigate the challenges of daily life. Thanks so much for listening. A quick disclaimer, the content of this podcast is for educational purposes only. It is not intended to be a substitute for professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your licensed mental health provider. Tim, good morning.
Hey, good morning, Sam. Looking forward to our conversation this morning. How are you doing?
Good. Likewise, I'm excited. Tim, today we're going to talk a little bit about stigmas with mental health. And so essentially this conversation is kind of prompted by the idea that you will find a lot of people when they think of counseling, in almost a not very positive light.
Sure.
That counseling is like really reserved just for like the really messed up people, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And so I was just curious, what are some of the common stigmas you hear in regards to that? Like what are some of the common refrains you hear? And I don't know, maybe talk a little bit about like why some of that is and why certain people are much more hesitant to thinking about emotional health and pursuing counseling, and the judgment that I think can get placed upon other people that do see a counselor or do go to counseling.
Right. It's a great question. And like most great questions, there's probably like a truth within tension, or there's a mix of strength. It's like not every aspect of that is problematic. There may be some elements that we need to affirm, while also what needs to be corrected. So I don't know completely why the stigma exists. It certainly I think it's reducing. There seems to be a more of an openness to mental health care. There certainly is much more of an emphasis in our broader culture that's a necessary thing to be considered and to be treated. But there is still a big gap between saying I need mental health care, or I need to take care of my emotional health or my wellness. And so that's like other people. It's great for other people. I'm just not certain. I'm just not certain it's something that I want to sign up for. And I feel it even as a practitioner, as a mental health professional, the idea of calling and scheduling and going to see a counselor personally, there's still an element of how about I not? Like who wants to go to the doctor? Right. Who wants to go to the dentist? It's like if I say, "Hey, I went to the dentist today," you'd be great. Everybody should go to the dentist. But it's not like it's going to be like, yes, good for, like, there's an element of, and if I said, you know what, I had a whole bunch of cavities, and the immediate question will be like, are you not taking care of your oral health? Like you have responsibility here. Are you shirking your responsibility? And so in the mental health space, there's those kinds of questions about, is this a personal reflection on me as like, am I weak? Am I psychologically weak? And what's scary, I think, for people is, what if the answer to that's yes?
Right.
What does that mean? That I like that can feel like a almost like a terminal problem, almost like, well, if I find out that I'm psychologically weak, or that I am somehow emotionally broken, or that I'm somehow, those are strong pictures in people's minds. Like, how about I not go find that out? Like, I don't want to know. And so, many people just choose not to and say, no, I'm not going to go pursue help. And so pursuing counseling can be really hard for people. There's some gender differences. Like, I don't think the stigma is more women are willing to seek out, counseling than men, but that's also true in the medical field. So it's not just in the mental health field. Men tend to, it's like, I'm not dying and I'm certainly not bleeding, so I'm not going to the doctor. And it's like, if I'm dying, then I'll go. And I would suspect that most people will resonate with the gender difference as it relates to the willingness to seek out help. And most people probably can affirm that as that's by and large true. There are certainly women who are very resistant to getting help. There are certainly very many men who are very open to going and getting help. So there's a lot of overlap in that space. So it's like there is a lot of variability. In many regards, men and women on most measures are more alike than they are different. But there are clearly differences in that regard. And the question becomes: is that biology? Is that cultural socialization?
Yeah,
I don't know how much of each. Both are involved. I don't know how much weight to give either of those two, and it might be different for different people.
Yeah. Well, what do you like specifically for men being so resistant to like help-seeking behavior, like seeing a counselor or a doctor or something like that? What are some of your like initial, like, I think these are probably some of the bigger like factors as to why that's generally the case?
That's a great question. I'm gonna, in good counselor fashion, throw that question back at you.
Okay.
Like, I'm curious, like, what are your initial thoughts? Like, what would be some of your theories of that problem, or like even personally, like what would lead you to be more resistant towards asking for help? And maybe not even thinking just in terms of mental health, but just like, is there a hesitancy or a sense of like what drives this sense that we should be able to do it on our own?
Yeah. We were talking a little before, but it was like much of our culture values, particularly in men, that they would be strong, they would be tough, they would be self-sufficient. And as particularly in America, the less you can rely on anybody else, the more successful American you are, And so I think that narrative, particularly for men, runs pretty deep. It's in all of our movies. It's in our music. It's it's in so many of those places. And so
it's like men rescued the damsel in distress.
Exactly. And so I think that's probably a big.
Did you catch in the new Spider-Man movie that theme where it was it was the Amazing Spider-Man, the middle guy.
Yeah, the Andrew Garfield one.
He never, in his movie, he never rescued the girl.
Well, because it's so tragic because she, spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't seen him, but like she dies, right? Like he doesn't save her.
Right. And so guess what he gets to do?
He gets to save the girl.
He gets to save the girl. And it's like, that is such a deep storyline across history and across culture.
Well, because I found myself like very moved by it.
Well,
like
the whole theater, when I was there, it's like the whole theater's like cheering for this. We want him to be able to save the girl. And
it's a powerful scene.
And so we're talking about a deep story rooted in our cultural. I mean, to use like deep psychological terms, we're talking about like collective unconscious kind of stuff. We're talking about archetypes. We're talking about these deep stories that people resonate with. And you look at the popular movies and popular stories that have an enduring across time, that theme is not absent.
Yeah, sure.
And so So I think there's an element where that theme probably expresses itself and bubbles up to this element of not seeking help. It seems to me to be a pretty logical stream or connection that if you're supposed to be strong, and if you're going to be rewarded for being strong, and if you're going to be given the accolades of the superhero, you better not have weaknesses and have need help, because if you need help, that means you can't save. And so I think that's pretty deeply rooted.
Yeah.
And I think that's where, like, there are elements of strength from that, as well as liabilities and weaknesses. It's like, we do want people to have strength. We do want people to be tough-minded and have grit,
perseverance and grit.
Right. And so, but
be able to endure when life gets very challenging. Like, that's a very good thing.
Right. But it has to be, there's always a shadow side then.
Totally.
It's like, and so what we see with men is that rather than asking for help, men tend to act out their dysfunction through drugs, alcohol, pornography, list the vice.
Yeah.
And men seek help from those things. And so men have a lot of help-seeking behaviors. They're just toxic or they're broken. And so if you look at all the ways in which men self-soothe, you will find that men really do seek out help. They just do it in places that are not particularly good or helpful or healthy. And so addictions, overeating, obsessiveness about whatever the latest obsession is. It's like, whatever can distract me from my pain, I will go and do. And so there is a downside to that process that has to be considered. And men will often just not get help until it's like almost too late.
Sure.
And I happen to work in a clinical field where that's very common. It's like, it's not uncommon for my phone to ring and be like, I'm in absolute crisis. My marriage is falling apart. I've just been caught by my spouse in a raging sex addiction, and I need help because I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to lose my family. Everything is coming apart. So, okay, now I'll seek help. And it's like, well, now we're almost beyond the point. Like now this is emergency level kind of help that is very invasive, and it's like even the helping is catastrophic. It's like the interventions are severe, and to get that kind of help is expensive and it's painful, and it's like that help was needed 20 years ago. And being able to express ourselves in some of our previous episodes where we've talked about emotional vulnerability and dealing with shame and addressing the life stories of our lives that can become disordered and difficult. Well, we would have benefited a long time ago had we got help back in those areas. But but many men just wait until that crisis point.
No, that's good. And I just even hear you say that reminds me of like, oh yeah, this is like the whole reason why we're trying to do this podcast, is to provide resources for people, and particularly men, before it reaches this disaster crisis mode, so that we could be healthy men and healthy humans. So what would be your answer to why, how would you put this in a positive rather than a negative, in the sense that like, this is why it is good for us to be actively pursuing healthy mental health, if that's good mental health, like counseling if necessary. Like how would you put that as like, hey, yeah, here's my elevator pitch, my 1-minute elevator pitch, why you shouldn't have necessarily a negative stigma to this, but like why this is actually of great benefit and value?
Well, I think it's because the evidence is pretty clear that talking helps. So being able to talk something out is a very beneficial kind of process. And so talking about things in the right way can be very healing. Talking about things in the wrong way can actually be damaging. So it's like we can talk ourselves into problems and into more chaos. We can talk ourselves out of that. And oftentimes that's where relationship becomes so valuable. It's like, if we want to, like, there's this element of like, and I'm probably not in the majority within my career field. Like, I don't think everybody needs to be going to see counselors.
Sure.
Like there is a level around which, yes, would people benefit? Of course. But you can think in terms of pastoral care, solid friendships of accountability and connection, and where there's genuine authenticity within the relationship. Coaches, like what I would call the coaching movement, that doesn't focus on just on healing trauma or healing painful space, but kind of here are steps we can take towards thriving and towards growth. All of those kinds of processes are really useful when they're in their proper place. I think where I'm most concerned is when people really need mental health care and they refuse to get it. But not everybody needs to be going out and calling a counselor for help. Would they benefit? Well, if it's the right kind of conversation, yes. It's like we benefit tremendously from an ongoing dialogue between people. And so it's often difficult for my clients to know when they're finished, because they find the conversation helpful.
Sure. And
it's like, at what point do you say, I don't need this anymore, when what I'm doing is helpful? It's like, do I have to do it? No. I need to have resources in my life so that I can continue good conversation, but I don't have to be doing it with a therapist anymore. I don't have to be paying the high cost of that kind of treatment, because it's not necessary for everybody all the time. But it is beneficial, and many people find it helpful, and they ought to consider it way before they often do. And I think that's the tough balance to find, of like, when is it time for me to pursue that kind of help? And I don't have a good answer to that. I really don't know. It's typically probably when we would say signs and symptoms are severe or getting severe. Marriage counseling is like very beneficial even for healthy couples. It's like there's an element of bringing a third party into the conversation and saying, here are the principles of how healthy marriages include these kinds of dynamics, and bringing in a third party to converse with you can be really beneficial even for healthy couples. But again, it's not an absolute necessity. That could happen in a small group within a church setting. That could happen just even if a couple has open dialogue. They can bring in that third party through a good book and say, let's take these ideas that are written down and let's talk them out. Let's do a date night. Let's dig deep. Let's build vulnerability and connection. Let's take these principles and apply them to our marriage, and healthy couples can continue to grow without seeing a professional.
That's good. Yeah, I feel like at its core, it's just I feel like pride is so easy to identify in someone else, but so hard to see in yourself, right? Like, oh, I know you need help, but no, I'm good, But at the end of the day, it's this lack of humility that says, like, no, I have some deficits. I have areas in my life where I need assistance, and I need someone else to give me new tools to be healthy with, And it's like this pride. It's the lack of wanting to need anyone else or depend on anyone else, and
right. So maybe this would be a good tie back to our previous episode that we recorded. Whether it gets released in this order or not is another question. But when we were talking about the theories of change, I think for many people, the resistance towards change is because we're not aware of the severity with which we need to. So it's that pre-contemplation space. It's like, I don't want to hear that there's things that I'm unaware of. It's like, that doesn't, that's kind of insulting. Like, there's an element of when I'm confronted with something, if I'm not predisposed towards saying, of course there's things I don't know, and the things that I don't know, I want to get into the know, I have a desire to learn and grow, then new information isn't insulting. Then it's not, but if we're not kind of predisposed towards learning and growth, we're going to find new information about our need to change threatening and scary, and we'll probably be resistant to it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, definitely.
And I think too, like as children, if we think back on our life stories, it's like, do we have models in our life of people who are willing to communicate about tough things and about ways they need to grow? And do we see help-seeking behaviors? And probably not. That's probably an area where many people haven't seen their parents being willing to get help for their own individual issues. So we get conditioned early on. There's also a developmental process that I think is actually good and right. And that's where we want to be able to do things on our own. And we want, as much as it's frustrating for the parent, there's something beautiful about the child saying, no, I do. It's like an astute parent knows that this child is developing autonomy, and that sense in which I want to do it on my own is a very, very good developmental process. It needs to be shepherded well. It needs to be affirmed and corrected of sort. It's like there's a strength to saying, I want to do it. I want my children to have a sense of, if there's an obstacle in my way, daggone it, I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to rally all of my resources that I have to get that solved. I'm not going to just quickly move into a place of somebody else solve the problem for me.
Yeah.
And I think many regards we might tend to look at help seeking as a statement of, I'm just not competent on my own, rather than seeing help seeking as an expression of our autonomy. It's like, I'm going to come for help because I'm smart, because I'm resourceful, because I know I don't know.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to come get help because you know something I don't know, and I want to learn from you. Well, that's really resourceful and good. And that kind of help seeking is really powerful. But if it's a learned helplessness of like, I can't do anything, come rescue me.
Sure.
Well, that kind of help seeking is actually not as that's more enabling. And it's not that some therapists wouldn't enable their clients and aren't teaching them to develop a sense of personal strength. If you can do this, you have the resources. You don't have to. You can solve this outside of my office. You can take steps on your own. You can do it.
Yeah.
And finding those balances is really
and I
tough.
think that's what most people don't understand, is that they do need help, and they are often getting help. You were saying this particularly with men too, but you are getting help. It's just, where are you getting it from?
Right.
And a lot of people think, well, if you got to go to a counselor, it must be really bad,
Right.
But it's like, no, I mean, everyone, obviously there are certain things that are deeper that need professional help. But at the end of the day, most people are all wrestling with the same things. Just how does it, work itself out in your life? So I think that's a helpful shift in not, thinking of it in such a negative way when you understand. It's like, yeah, we all need help. It's like, and we're all getting help from somewhere, something. It's just a matter of who. Is it a friend? Is it a pastor? Is it is it, whatever. So I think that's a helpful.
Right. I think one of the other potential obstacles and this is where terminology can get a little, defining terms can become difficult. It's like you hear we have these tragedies and crises within our nation. I think of like the school shootings or mass shootings as a particular example. It's like immediately after a mass shooting of some sort, you will hear all of this rhetoric around mental health care. Mm-hmm. And so, well, if that's mental health care, why should I seek it out if I'm not homicidal, if I'm not suicidal,
that, right,
if I'm not, it's like, and so it's like the times that mental health comes into the public conversation
is in a very exaggerated light.
Right. It's in the very severe, there's very severe cases. And it's like it's people, it's like personalities like the Joker. It's like, okay, this is what mental health care really takes care of, is we're going to deal with the really, really severe cases of mental illness. And what does that have to do with me? It's like, that's not the space in which I'm living. And so it doesn't even, I think for many people, there may be a sense in which that's what counselors do. And I don't need, like, that's not.
And a lack of understanding that it's like actually doesn't have to be that intense.
Right. Well, and that's where I think terminology always, like, our words fail us in terms of the depth and breadth of meaning. It's like if mental health care means, you know what, I want to have a good, competent person that can ask me really good questions and challenge me. Yeah. And that's what therapy is. It's like many people would say, that's what executive coaching is. That's what coaches do. Okay. It's like, you're going to optimize me. You're going to help me grow. You're going to challenge me, and you're going to press me, and you're going to ask me really good questions that make me think, and that's going to sharpen me. It's iron sharpening iron. Sign me up for that. Well, that's kind of what many counselors provide for people. But there's also a spectrum. It's like it's like you have that space that is a form of mental health care. But I sometimes think about it. That's where the coaching, much of the pastoral work happens in that space. Mental health care is almost referred to in our culture and in our media kind of spaces. Mental health care is about the severity of anxiety, depression, suicidality, homicidal spaces, schizophrenia, bipolar, like what I would call the very severe cases of mental illness. And yet we talk about it all as mental health care. And so it's confusing for people. And
totally.
It's almost confusing for me as a practitioner. And I live in that space. Like, it's like, that's my native territory. And I have to be carefully thinking through all of those processes. For most people who aren't thinking about it at all or very little, they hear mental health care, mental health counselor. Well, I'm not in that space. And so I think that might be part of why there's that hesitancy to seek out help.
Yeah. No, that's good. And, similarly to this, and in particular, you're talking anxiety and depression, and like those things statistically are soaring up, especially in like younger generation of people. There's also an increasing usage of medication for these things, and I feel like there's also a stigma towards that. If someone needs medication for anxiety, there's a stigma related to that as well. Do you feel like we're just looking at this is the same situation, or are there different pieces towards like those stigmas as well?
Right there that's a complicated that's a great question, complicated one.
And maybe we could reserve that for another conversation.
Well, no, I mean,
talking about medication.
Well, let me talk about it to some degree. It's like the question in my mind is like, do we have a problem of over medication? Probably.
Sure.
Would more people benefit from considering medications? Probably. So it's like, okay, what's the deal with that? Like, okay, so now there's this contradiction, like internal, like I feel the contradiction immediately. It's like, like I have seen people's lives tremendously improved by starting medication. It's like has been a clear benefit for many people. It helps open up space. It helps deal with some of the biochemical processes that really it's useful and beneficial and really needs to be considered as a legitimate treatment that can be really useful. There are some people who try it and it's like the side effects, it's just not a good fit for them. It doesn't work the way they prefer, and they need to work with their doctor in saying, okay, what are other options? There are treatments that are helpful that are non-medicine kind of treatments. Mm-hmm. And so many people will go for anxiety and they will take anxiety medication and never do the other treatments for anxiety. And they're just in essence forestalling the inevitable. As soon as they stop their medications, they're going to have a rebound effect from their medication, and they're going to have to face their anxiety anyway. And so with anxiety, there's often a lot of good treatments for forms of anxiety and depression that don't require medication. And many people say, I want to try those first. And I would say, well, then try those first. Like that's not a bad space. But if you're doing some really sound, useful interventions for anxiety and depression that just aren't seeming to work, or it's like the problems continue to persist, well, medication is often the missing link. And so I often like to think in terms of, well, we don't have to not do them both. Like
sure.
Take advantage of the resources that are available. Many people have a strong, I don't want to put chemicals in my body. And I respect that. Like there's good reason to be very concerned about taking chemicals and taking drugs. It's like, be careful and think it through and look at as much information as you can. And if you're able to do it without medication, great. But it can be, there is at times a stigma. And again, I think the stigma for medications is reducing as well. There's a level where I think that's not as severe of a stigma as it used to be. I hope there's an element where it's like, I hope that we don't get to the place where people just take medications because that's just what you do. It's like, let's be judicious in thinking through, like, is there a way to be healthy mentally without medications? Well, I hope so. And I would hope that we advocate for health and wellness in a way that doesn't require medical intervention.
Did you ever read Brave New World by, I think it's Aldous Huxley?
No, tell me about it.
It's an old book. Like, it was written, I think, in the 40s. I could be very wrong on that date, but it's an older book, but it's a dystopian future. But essentially, everyone just does drugs and sits in a chair and watches TV and just numbs out.
Sure.
And that's where everything, kind of the pinnacle of your life. And so now obviously that's a fictional book, but you can see how the easiest solution sometimes can be not necessarily the best solution.
Sure.
But I think I'm kind of deviating a little bit, but I think a lot of the stigmas towards medication is well, if I need medication, then I must be really broke.
Sure.
I must be really broken. Something must be really wrong with me.
Right.
And again, it's just I think there might be something wrong. But that doesn't mean you are inherently doesn't mean you're not valuable. It doesn't mean you're not lovable. All these other things I think we start to attach this. If this is true, I can't handle that.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Well,
Maybe you can help.
Well, what I think
say a little better what I'm trying to say.
Well, I think what we have this picture that if I'm struggling or if I feel weak or broken or vulnerable, that's a statement of value.
Yeah.
And it's not a statement of value. In fact, those things which are most valuable to us that are fragile or are weak we take great care of those things and we protect them because they're valuable. We treat them with whatever they need to protect them. And so I think I'm just thinking of like a piece of fine jewelry or a dish or a vase or some sort of glass item that's really, really fragile, or sculpture that's really old and it's wearing down and the stone's getting weak. It's like we're gonna protect that because it's valuable.
Yeah.
And that's not a shame. Protecting it's not a shameful thing.
Yeah.
It's like that's actually we should because it's valuable. But shame will often lead a person to say, if I'm feeling weak or broken or something's hurting, well, what the hell's wrong with you? And we'll beat ourselves up and we'll actually kind of throw it on the ground and stomp on it because it's like, well, that's not compassionate. It's not the way forward.
Yeah.
And so
I think even for men would really benefit from understanding this idea, yes, we can be physically strong, right? But like comparatively, I think in like through a spiritual lens, like comparatively to God, like our strength is so small. Like even if we're just talking physical strength, I'm like, okay, cool. You can bench 200 pounds. Like you didn't make a mountain. Like you didn't speak and breathe life into the whole world. Like comparatively, like we are very weak. Like we are very small in comparison. And so I feel like that would actually be a really helpful thing to reflect upon in the, the grand scheme of creation. It's like, we are very small. We are weak. We do depend on other people. And if we don't recognize that, and we don't actually embrace that, like it becomes a really crippling thought.
Right. There's this other additional dynamic I think is difficult for men, is that men are attractive to other men and to women. Men are attractive for their strength and their courage and their toughness. But what people want relationally, and particularly what women want relationally then from those men, is sensitivity, warmth, kindness, and so it's like the attraction to is different than what's desired from. And so
that's fascinating.
So it's like men get rewarded emotionally and relationally, sexually, from strength and so it's like, again, it's like, you look at the athletes, they get the beautiful women, but what women would say that they want from a spouse or from a man is emotional connectiveness and the sense of strength. It's like, well, those two things almost mitigate against one another. And so it's like the very thing that draws a person to a man might stand in contradiction to what's desired from that man once the relationship is established. And that's a complicated problem. And men need to recognize that they can be both strong and tough and powerful, and all like the Pew Research Council talked about what is society, men and women, what do they say about masculinity and about what's desirable in that space. And it's like all of those things are like desired at one level, and yet then they have this shadow side of weakness where it's like it becomes a problem as well. And so men often feel this tug of war between which do you want from me? Do you want me to be strong and powerful and a strong leadership, and is a big one that's really makes that, like, men and women will talk about, makes a man attractive if he's a good leader. It's like all of these strengths and these things that make men attractive are the very things that would potentially lead to say, well, then asking for help would not be those things. And so, well, that's a big dilemma for men. And it's like we have to come to terms with that. We can be both. We can be strong, and we can be tough, and we can be tough-minded, and we can have grit, and we can go the extra mile. But we also are vulnerable, and we're also weak, and we also are emotional, and we also need things. And we have to have community, and we have to have a place to be able to be open with one another, and to be vulnerable with our spouses, and to be emotionally connected, and to be able to cry, and to be able to express joy, and to be able to express all of the full range and color of emotion that's possible. We want to be able to connect all of those things relationally. And so as men, I think my challenge is let's be real men. Let's cover that whole process. And that means asking for help. That means being willing to be vulnerable where it's appropriate. But there are times when let's go, where we have a war to fight. We have a battle to win. And that now is not the time to sit and just talk about how hard it is. It's like, no, you're gonna, you press through it. When the warriors are on the battle lines, in Ukraine, now is not the time to have group dynamic parties, but we're not going to just sit around and talk about how hard it is. We're going to be tough, and we're going to make it happen. However, on the flip side of that, when it's time to come down from that, it's time to come down. It's time for us to have vulnerability. It's time for us to deal with our traumas. It's time for us to ask for help. Yeah. And that's a very, very complicated process, particularly for men. Women seem to be able to navigate those spaces of incredible strength, because women are also incredibly strong. And like if any man has watched his wife have a baby, and go through the processes of childbirth, you know how tough women are. It's like women are incredibly tough, and they can press through incredible obstacles. Now, what often happens is that women express emotion right with that process. So it's like while they're expressing their strength, they're also crying. While they're expressing their strength, they're expressing other emotions as well. And so for many men, that's confusing, because it's like, if you're going to be strong, well, how can you be like those two mitigating, like for men,
they almost feel very separated things.
Yeah. It feels like
men.
That's it's like,
I'll go cry when this is all done, right, in my room by myself. But yeah, that's interesting. They're very separate things.
Well, and many men feel manipulated when their wife is crying.
Huh.
They feel a sense in which you're using tears to try to, like, I'm supposed to now be sensitive and nice and not, I got to be gentle with you because you're somehow really, really fragile right now because you're crying. And so I got to be, and so there's this social pressure that, but don't make the girl cry.
Okay. Yeah.
And it's like, well, no, time. No, she's not weak because she's crying. She's actually incredibly strong, and she's showing her emotion simultaneously to that. Men don't do that the same way. Now, again, I'm using broad categories, and there will be women who don't and men who do. And it's like, and that's not a statement of judgment around. It's like, there's a lot of variability across that, but in broad brush strokes, most people will resonate with that dynamic. And most people that don't experience it personally will say, I see the dynamic in the broader ways we understand those realities. And so it's a really complicated space for men to be able to ask for help and also be strong at the same time.
Okay, I think we'll go one last question, and this is a more goofy question, but in movies, okay, this idea of men being both strong and weak, what's the best movie character of a man that embodies both of these things? Obviously it's a movie and it's embellished or fake.
That's
or whatever.
A great question.
When you think of this character is a great character of a man who embodies both strength but also vulnerability and weakness. I also understand if you can't think of something off the top of your head.
Fascinating question. Wonderful question. maybe, and I don't know that I would say that there's probably a ton of examples, but probably 3 come to mind.
Okay.
Right off the top. And maybe it's because these are getting at, maybe 4, because these are getting at some of what I would say some of my favorite movies, would be Aragorn in Lord of the Rings.
That's a great one.
I would say potentially, I would also probably put in that category Frodo. Frodo and Sam, like both of have that toughness and vulnerability in the same character. There was the other one. Oh, Russell Crowe's Gladiator, Maximus.
That's a good one.
Like he is he expresses a great deal of vulnerability and longing and emotionally depth, as well as being, I'll go the distance with you, and I'll fight to the end. Him, Braveheart, Mel Gibson's,
it's a good one too.
Wallace,
William Wallace.
I think we see it in some of the war movies as well, like the Saving Private Ryan, and some of the men who are willing to just go into the hornet's nest kind of space.
But these aren't left out with lots of, I think in many of these, all of these men cry. Like, there's a clear representation of this is not just brute strength at work, and there is a vulnerability and a weakness and a tenderness that is there. I think Jean Valjean and Les Mis, like this incredible strength of character to address change and to be humble but to also be strong, and I will bring correction to my life and live and so I would say, like, in many of the really captivating stories, we'll see both that strength and weakness, or that strength and need for support. I think that The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings are this sense in which we need community and the fellowship. We need we need this, because on our own, any one of us will be taken out easily. Together, we might be able to stand up against the dragon, and if we die, we die. Yeah. But we're going to need each other in that journey. Dude, it's so good. Cool. Yeah. Those are great examples.
But I think, like, for people who are needing help, if you're listening to this and you feel like you're on the edge, reach out for help. Like, you can start with your pastor. You can start with a good friend. You can build the courage to change. Reach out, call a therapist, get some referrals, reach out and get help. If you're in an absolute crisis, you're suicidal, reach out for help immediately. Call 911, call the suicide hotline. But if you're in a really deep, dark place, don't hesitate. Reach out and get the process started. We can't do it alone.
That's great.
All right. Thanks, Sam. Great conversation. Appreciate you. And thank you all for listening. If you find this podcast helpful, please subscribe, share it with your friends. Feel free to drop us a note in our email as well.
And ask us some questions.
Yes.
We want more ideas of what you want to hear us talk about.
That would be fantastic.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Guideposts with Dr. Tim Stauffer. If you're finding this podcast beneficial, please share it with a friend or leave us a review. Also, make sure to check out the show notes where you can find links to resources as well as an email address. We want to hear from you. Send us your questions, feedback, and topic ideas for future episodes. Thanks for listening.